we are here talking to Eric Zimmer. Welcome, Eric. Welcome to The Only One in the Room.
Thank you. I am so glad to be here.
And we're so happy to have you. Your podcast, The One You Feed, is based on a parable that I think most people know, and we'll talk more about that. But I thought it might be fun to bring up 3 other parables and see if maybe we can, or you can, fill in the missing words for these other popular parables. What do you think?
Let's give it a try.
Okay. The first one is the Emperor's New Blank.
Clothes.
Yes. The second one is the Prodigal Blank Returns.
Sun.
Sun. Okay, the last one might be a little tricky because I had a different answer in my head, but it's the Fox and the Blank.
Well, probably hedgehog.
Actually, it's yes. See, that's another. That is a parable. There's also the Fox and the Hound, but this is the Fox and the Grapes. That's one of the top 3 most popular parables.
All right.
And I believe it's.
I don't think I know that one.
Yeah, I think it's this fox who really wants these grapes, and they're too high for him to reach. So he makes these bargains with other animals so he can get to them. But I don't remember what the lesson is in that.
All right, I'm going to look that up while we're
you look it up,
while
honey.
You guys are getting into the interview, and we'll come back, circle back around.
Yes. So thank you for playing with us, Eric. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I love your parable. So like I said, we're going to talk about that. I'm Laura Cathcart Robbins, and this is The Only One in the Room, but I'm never the only one in this room because, as usual, my boyfriend, producer, and co-host, Scott Slaughter, who I call Hun, is here as well.
Hi, honey.
Hey, Hun. So, as I said before, we're talking to Eric Zimmer. He is a behavior coach, certified interfaith spiritual director, podcast host, and writer. He says he's endlessly inspired by the quest for a greater understanding of how our minds work and how to intentionally create the lives we want to live. I love that intentionally in there. Intentionally is a word I started using probably about 5 years ago because it really articulated my intent. But it articulated the actions I was taking. And, I know that it's probably a therapized word too, or maybe a word that's used more in spiritual work, but I just really like it. And it describes best the actions that I take for me, for my own recovery and for my work in race and in my writing and, all of this stuff. So in race, in like race relations and that kind of stuff. So, you are the only one intentionally feeding the good wolf. Can you tell us that parable before we start or get into the interview?
Sure. As you mentioned, many of your listeners will maybe have heard some version of it. The way I tell it is, first, I don't attribute it anywhere. It's been often referred to as a Native American parable, but I've had Native American people insist it is not. I've had other Native American people insist it is. So no one really knows. So I don't really attribute it anywhere. But the parable goes that we all, there's a grandparent talking with their grandchild, and they say, in life there are 2 wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops and thinks about it for a second and looks up at their grandparent and says, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed.
Yes. I know this, and it still gives me chills to hear that. Right, Hun? Isn't it like one of those?
Absolutely. And I think, I probably heard that parable and, for many years until I got into this recovery idea, and somebody told it, and it had a whole new connotation to it.
Yes.
It made a lot of sense, and it actually empowered me, which I think I had lacked the ability to observe that choice at the time.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree, and the impact of it, I think, is so evident for me now that how that statement impacts me. And the awareness I have around everything since I've been sober. So I want to talk about addiction, actually,
Yeah.
with you. And so you were homeless and addicted to heroin at age 24, but I don't want to start there. I want to go back a few years, and maybe you could tell us, just tell us about you and tell us how you ended up in that place at age 24.
Yeah, I think growing up, I was just, for some reasons I understand, and probably some reasons that none of us fully understand, I was a troubled child from very early on. I mean, by the time I was 10, I was a kleptomaniac. I was stealing, simply to steal. Like, I loved doing it. So I was always in trouble. And in my early teenage years, I started, drinking a little bit, and I just did it strangely. I didn't do it often, but I did it strangely. Like, I'd drink at night, I'd wake up in the morning, there'd still be liquor around, and I would just drink it first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Just strange behavior. But then I gave it up because I had started this tutoring program where we were tutoring disadvantaged children. High schoolers were tutoring elementary school children. And so I saw what alcohol and drugs were doing to their lives, what their parents were doing. And so I gave it up until I was 18. And then when I was 18, for a variety of different reasons, I was in a lot of pain, and somebody said, take a drink. And I said, all right. And that it was like getting shot out of a cannon at that point. I was rarely sober again for the next 6 years. And my story, I think, is like a lot of people's. It was just, I started drinking alcohol, then moving on to marijuana, and then harder and harder drugs. And the whole thing just progressed for me over those years.
Where were you? Where did you grow up?
Columbus, Ohio.
Columbus, okay. And then, so were you like middle class? Were you like, what kind of neighborhood culture did you grow up in?
Yeah, a middle class suburb. Mm-hmm. A middle class suburb.
And because I imagined you growing up in a middle class suburb. I would imagine that heroin's probably not as popular as alcohol in a middle class suburb. So, I mean, it might be.
I was a musician. Mm-hmm. And so, I joined a band at one point, and that's what they were doing.
Right.
And so I just was like, well, let me try that. And I did, and loved it.
And you loved it. Did you shoot, or did you smoke or snort?
I shot it.
You shot it.
Yep.
Was that scary for you?
I mean, not as scary as it would be today.
Yeah. Right. Right.
I'm extraordinarily fortunate that I went through all that kind of when I did. I mean, I just think it's a much more dangerous world out there today than it was back then. But yeah, there were certainly scary moments. I mean, it's interesting because I got sober at 24, and I stayed sober about 7 years, and I went back out and started drinking again. And I never went back to the heroin. But what's interesting is the second time around, I was every bit as sick as I was the first time. But the consequences were totally different. I wasn't homeless. I wasn't looking at going to jail for a long time. I mean, none of that stuff was happening. I was doing well. I was succeeding career-wise, all those things. And I say that to say that, it was simply the nature of our laws around drugs and alcohol that caused one of those situations to be very problematic, the heroin situation, and the other, the alcohol situation, to be problematic in a completely different way. But I was able to see inside it was just the same for me. Mm-hmm. I was just as sick either case. It's just that with alcohol, I could drive down to the corner store and buy it relatively inexpensively, and heroin, I had to do all sorts of crazy things to get it.
Right. Can you give us an example of some of the crazy things you had to do?
Oh, I was stealing all the time. I was breaking into, I was doing, breaking and entering lots of, what I was finally arrested on was grand theft and forgery from stealing checkbooks. I was going into really bad neighborhoods. And as you sort of said, you took one look at me and you were like, I imagine you were
Yes.
you were a suburban guy, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wandering into neighborhoods where they're like, well, they see me coming, and just putting myself in lots of really dangerous situations along those lines. Those are the main things. But then just, putting anything in your veins intravenously like that is not a great idea.
Yeah. Do you talk about how long you've been sober now?
I do. I have been sober. So as I mentioned, I got sober. I stayed sober about 7 years. I went back out and drank, and now I have been back. I just celebrated 15 years about a month ago.
Wow. Yeah, congratulations.
So you and I are very similar in time,
We're
I
close.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, congratulations on that. I just think that it is something to celebrate. It's life affirming, I recently sat on a panel with Beth Macy, who wrote Dope Sick, that the book and the TV series.
Yep.
She's a really big supporter of harm reduction, and I was really curious to hear your thoughts on that, because you mentioned how much different it was for you then than it would be now if you were to use IV heroin. Obviously, with the fentanyl crisis, almost any drug is potentially lethal now.
Yes.
Including gummies, including, with maybe the exception of alcohol. I haven't heard of that, but every other kind of way you can do a drug has been tainted. I am learning about harm reduction, and I was just curious what your thoughts were on it.
Well, it's interesting because when I got sober in 1994 from heroin, I had a number of friends who also got sober at that time from methadone. And in those days, we didn't really think they were sober.
Right.
Right? And I looked at those people and I was glad that I had gotten, quote unquote, all the way sober.
Yeah.
So my feelings about this have changed a lot over the years as I've learned more. I think that from a public policy perspective, harm reduction makes all the sense in the world. We should absolutely be, there should be needle exchanges. I mean, I think we should be decriminalizing, if not outright legalizing, a lot of drugs so that we stopped overdose problems, right? So that we took the money out of the hands, made it not illegal, and put that money into tax dollars. So, I mean, I think from a public policy perspective, there's all kinds of harm reduction things that make 100% sense to me. And I do think for some people, harm reduction as a philosophy and as approach to life makes a lot of sense. I know that for me, I tried my version of harm reduction, which was moderation, a lot of times. And so there wasn't a turn it down switch for me.
Right.
And so in my case, I just don't think harm reduction in that sense of just don't do it as much applies to me directly personally.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's lots of medical assisted types of treatment these days that I think make sense. And like I said, from a public policy perspective, I'm 100% in support of it. I mean, I think the reality is people want to get high or drunk, they will. We tried prohibition, it didn't work.
Right.
And so we're playing the same game, and it's a really dangerous game right now. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I really want to thank you for that, because I feel like my experience is the same, where it would not have worked for me. I certainly tried, before I set a sobriety date, all I did was try to moderate and cut back and cut down. And to be clear, what Beth is talking about when she's talking about harm reduction are the medical treatments that reduce cravings for opiate addicts substantially. And in some cases, allow them to live what looks and feels like a normal, or I don't know if normal is the right word, but a life that doesn't raise eyebrows and doesn't get them thrown in jail and doesn't threaten their lives, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know people who've been on Suboxone for a number of years, and for all intents and purposes, they are leading very good, very robust lives.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know enough about the long-term effects of it to say any of that kind of stuff. But to me, that stuff's no different than like with alcoholism. I mean, you know, there's antabuse that you could take, which
Yes.
means if you take the antabuse and you drink, you get sick. So you don't drink. Like, why not? Like, why not take advantage of the tools that are out there?
Yeah. I knew someone who took the antabuse and then would drink anyway and would be so violently ill that you would think it would have stopped her from doing it again, but she just kept doing it over and over again. And then finally the antabuse was like out the window.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I feel like my path might have been like had I continued, which is why complete abstinence works for me best.
Yeah, it's funny before I got sober 15 years ago, I went to moderation management, which was a program that was around. Maybe it still is, because I knew what was coming. I had been in recovery before. I knew what was coming, which was, if I can't get this under control, it's total abstinence again. And you know, what person using wants that? And so I went to moderation management, and I tried so hard in that program. I was like an A student, except for the actually being able to moderate part of it.
Right.
If you got graded on effort, I would have gotten an A for effort because I so badly wanted to figure it out. That was really helpful for me, though. I'm really glad I did that because it just sort of smashed that last bit of maybe there's a way I'll figure this out.
Right. I had to be taken out by my knees with that. And there wasn't a surrender for me without that realization, that acceptance. And I too had to have all my other hopes dashed. I had figured out a way to do everything in my life, a hack or a workaround. And this was something that I could not get a handle on. And it was humiliating to me and baffling.
Yeah.
So coming from that place, you know, first with heroin and then with drinking, and then you're beaten, as you described. I don't know, you didn't say beaten, but that's the word I'm going to use.
Pretty well.
What does your journey to recovery look like?
In both cases, I got sober in 12-step programs. The first time it was 1994 in Columbus, Ohio, and there just was nothing else. And even 15 years ago in Columbus, Ohio, I don't feel like there was much of anything else. I'm sure there maybe was a little bit, but it was what I knew.
Yeah.
And so I got sober in 12-step programs. Over time, you know, I'm less involved than I was. And we could talk about that if we wanted to, but that was my path.
Okay. I do want to talk about that, but first
Yeah.
I just want to hear, because I think that there is a common misunderstanding that for someone like me, putting away the pills and not picking up a drink was the solution. And it was really the thing that allowed me to find the solution, which was recovery. So sobriety, abstinence wasn't the solution for me, but I couldn't have found recovery without it. So I wanted to hear about what you discovered about yourself during that time where you were finding recovery, or just from the time that you first just put it down into the recovery journey.
Yeah, when I got sober in 1994, I did it by going into detox and then long-term treatment and then a halfway house. And so the first really 9 months of my recovery was all recovery all the time. I mean, that was all I did, which was really a benefit in many ways. Now, most of it in those days, even treatment was, you know, more or less 90% 12-step oriented.
Right.
You know, but I learned all sorts of things about myself, and I agree with you. I mean, I think that taking away the substances is but a beginning place, and in some cases, you know, makes certain things worse.
Yes.
You know, I think that's an important thing to often say, because I'll hear people say to me like, well, I quit drinking and I feel worse. I'm like, well, yeah, you might for a little while. You know, you're not worse. You're actually far better off, but I understand why you're feeling that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had to get to, you know, why was I doing those things? And I don't necessarily mean, in the short term sense, like a why of like, oh, because my parents were a certain way. Although trauma, I think we know more and more about the role of trauma. And I think it plays a critical role, and we do need to understand that. But for me, it first was recognizing, like, what was it that I was unable or unwilling to feel that I was getting from drugs and alcohol, and what can I do with that?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
whether it be I was unwilling to feel pain, or I was unwilling to feel the dead grayness that comes when there's no substance, just the blankness of it all, the boredom. So, you know, recognizing what those are. My first number of years was, you know, I worked the 12 steps, and the 12 steps are a method of change, right? They have embedded in them a method of change, and depending on who you do certain steps with and what those people have you do, you might get something that's a little bit more like straight out of the 12-step orthodoxy, versus you might get something that's a whole lot more therapy based. I don't, you know, but but it turned me inwards. You know, it turned me inwards. And that was really the key, was to say, okay, like, yanking my headphones out. What is it that is going on inside me? And then from there, I led into, you know, then I started going to therapy, and did therapy. And then, you know, over the years, I mean, I've been given the first time around and the second time around, I've spent like 22 years of my life in recovery. So at this point, I've done a whole lot of different things in a healing modality.
Right.
All of which have been, you know, valuable to some degree. It's really hard for me to tweeze it apart. People will be like, well, do you think this was worth doing? I'm like, it's really hard for me to say out of context what did what, you know, because we're more complex than that. But most of the things I've done healing-wise have all been really beneficial.
You mentioned that you were like a kleptomaniac when you were younger, because it felt good. I think that's what you said. You like stealing. How long into your recovery did it take for you, those behaviors like that to go away? Like, do you remember? Like, was it instant for you?
It was instant, and then they came back.
Ah, tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think right away I got 100% on board with the whole trying, you know, in AA we talk about living, you know, a spiritual life. And so that came with certain ideas of what that meant. I wasn't capable then, I think, of figuring out exactly what that meant for me. So I just sort of adopted the fairly common morality that was given to me. And, you know, most any sort of moral, ethical system you're going to look at is going to say that stealing is probably not ideal. And so that stuff went away fairly quickly. But then it popped back up over the years in different places, as I began to think more about, like, well, what does it mean morally to me? You know, is it wrong to steal from Walmart? You know, is it wrong to steal from my brother? I mean, and those are questions I think everybody sort of has to figure out for themselves. So I think there came a period where I sort of went from, you know, I'm living by almost no moral code to a very strict one that was given to me by others, and then over time sort of living into, like, who do I want to be? What's my moral code? What's my, you know, what do I believe in? You mentioned the word intentionally earlier, right? And the thing I love about that word is that to be intentional, you have to actually really think about what's important. To me, that's the whole heart of why that's such a powerful thing, is to think about what matters to me. And so, I've had lots of different periods where I've kind of gone back through evaluating those things.
I was probably 2 or 3 years sober at a Starbucks, and the barista had messed up my order. And so they had taken out a coupon for a free cup of coffee off a stack of coupons for a free cup of coffee. I was the only person in the store. They put it on the counter. They handed me one, and then they went in the back to do something. And I watched my hand reach for the pile of coupons with the full intention to put them in my purse. But it was like watching myself on a show. I was like, what are you doing? You can't take those.
Yeah.
But of course I can take those. It's like 100 free cups of coffee. I'll be giving these out to people. I'll be using them. So much fun. And I realized at that moment that I was different. That impulse, not that I was different in that I didn't do anything bad, but I was aware of the impulse before it overtook me. Yeah. And I think that's how my recovery was working in my, I know that's how my recovery was working in my life. That was part of, that. And for me, when I'm talking about recovery, I'm really talking about recovering from the self-harming behaviors that I had been engaging in, whatever that looked like. Certainly taking pills and washing them down with booze was one of them. But the other ones were lying, absolutely stealing. That did not help my self-esteem when I stole or told a lie or even lied by omission. So I really tried to be intentional about what my recovery looked like and move toward that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even lying is an interesting one. What, when you really, on the surface, that sounds like, well, you shouldn't lie at all. But then we know if you think about it for more than a minute or two, you're like, well, but what about if it was to protect a child? What if it was to not hurt someone's feelings? And there was, there was no reason to tell them that particular truth. And I'm not saying I know the answer. I'm just saying that these are all things we think about. I think what you said there, though, that really resonated with me was the idea that not only did you have the awareness to see yourself doing it before the impulse, I think the other thing for me was that any behavior that I had to think of in the context also of, is this worth my recovery?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Is that this, someone else may be able to get away with this sort of behavior very easily. I, on the other hand, this could be the beginning of a slippery slope that ends in a very bad place.
100%.
And so, I had to think about those things differently than I would have if I wasn't, I think, in recovery.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Truly, I'm one of those people that if I were my coach, I would be like, you can't take any risks.
Yeah.
You've done it. We've seen the results. The lab results are in, that you cannot take any risks with this.
Yep. Whatever
those slippery slopes are, you need to stay off of them.
Yep.
Let's talk about transitioning into coaching for you. What was the inspiration for that, and how did you end up doing it?
Yeah, well, it came after I'd been doing the podcast for a little while.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, and people started reaching out to me saying, like, do you ever do one-on-one work with people? And I originally said, no, I don't. I haven't, it's not something I do, but I got asked about it a little bit more, and then I thought, well, would I like doing that? And I thought, I think I might. And then when I did it, the first few times I went like, oh, this is like being somebody's sponsor. Yes. And I loved doing that. And I, by that point in my life, had done it hundreds of times, And so, so that sort of led me into that. That's how I got into the coaching work.
And thank you for mentioning sponsor, because I did want to circle back and ask you about, because you said that it wasn't so much 12-step recovery for you anymore. That was I forgot how you put it, but I want to say that you drifted, but that wasn't your, those weren't your words.
Those are good words, though.
Okay. Can you tell us about that and what,
Sure.
if anything, you've substituted it with?
Yeah. Ultimately, I mean, I could share a little bit about why I drifted. It was that after a while and working, having done this show and hearing from lots of listeners and having coached lots of people, I stopped seeing such a hard line between myself as a person with a substance abuse issue, an alcoholic, and other people. And I felt like the 12-step work that I was doing kept drawing that line really hard. There's us, and then there's the normies. You're still sick. There was an element that went along with it that no longer felt it just didn't feel like it was the right thing for me and my connection back into the whole of the world, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it. Mm-hmm. And that's just me. It's not, I don't say that for everybody. And I also, I did a lot of translating in the 12-step programs of what spirituality meant to me. Mm-hmm. I was always like, someone would say God, and I would say, okay, well, actually to me, what that means is blah, blah. Like I felt like I was having to, pull out a dictionary and translate a lot, which was okay. It worked. And I got sober, and I owe my life to 12-step programs. But as I started to consider drifting away, I became worried because I stayed sober 7 years before I went back out. Mm. Yeah. And I don't think drifting away from 12-step meetings was the only reason I did that, but it was a big part of it. Mm-hmm. And so I really started thinking, like, well, what is it that I got from recovery? Like, if I had to sort of boil it down to, like, what is 12-step recovery doing for me? And I went, well, I think it's giving me a community. It's giving me a means of transforming. There's a 12-step program. There's a way to be of service. Yeah. And so then I went, well, are there other ways that I am maybe already getting that in my life? And if I'm not, how do I make sure I am? And so that was kind of the analysis I sort of went through, was like, okay, well, where do I get those things? Because I still feel like I need those things all the time. I still do.
Right.
And so that was kind of how I thought through it.
I think that's really interesting. And for those of you who are just listening, I was nodding my head along with a lot of that. Like, I understand. I call it mental gymnastics that I do when I translate certain things. I hear something and I translate it for me. I certainly do that in 12-step recovery. I do it, when people are talking about their kids and, to personalize the experience for me. I substitute things. But the spiritual piece of it is a really big one for me, because I don't believe in a deity, which is something I don't usually say because it's controversial. I mean, at this level, I say it in smaller rooms and to my friends, but I don't believe in a deity. So the everything that's personified for me has to be translated.
Yeah.
And so I was curious because it says that you are a certified interfaith spiritual director. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what that means, first of all, and then how you practice that?
Sure. I mean, spiritual direction is an idea that comes out of, it comes out of all traditions, but more recently, modern day is more a Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. And it's basically somebody who is on the journey with you, but is in a non-hierarchical position of power. So, for example, your priest is probably not necessarily your spiritual director because your priest occupies a position of power in that organization, in that framework, right? A sponsor is a much closer translation because a sponsor actually has, in a way, and in certain cases in 12-step programs, certain sponsors set them up as people of power, but it's not a role that was intended. It's not an official role.
No.
You know, a sponsor has no more rights or roles in a response in a 12-step meeting than anyone else does. It's somebody who's maybe a little further down the path with you, who's willing to walk with you. And so that's kind of what spiritual direction is. And I did really come through my 12-step time with a belief in that a spiritual life was important to me. And we could talk about, you know, what even does spiritual mean? You know, it means different things to different people. But I decided it was important to me, and it was something that I wanted to bring into the coaching work that I was doing with people. And so I went out and got a certification in interfaith spiritual direction, which meant that you learn enough about all the different traditions out there, you know, the different faiths, no faith at all, that you can, you know, accompany people from all different, you know, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Taoist, none of the above, right? And can walk people through that. And so for me, it was a real interest in, I've always been interested in all the world's religions, because I think from a very relatively early age, I was able to look at them and go, well, they're using different words, but I think they're kind of all talking about the same thing. Or at least there's enough commonality here that this stuff is kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
And so, it was just something I was really interested in doing.
Tell me about spiritual work with someone of no faith. What does spirituality mean in that case?
Yeah, I mean, spirituality to me, as I define it, is really just about connection. Mm-hmm. It's about connecting to the things that matter to us. And that connection could be simply to our family, it could be to our friends, it could be to nature, it could be to ourselves, it could be to, if you believe in a God, it could be to a generalized sense of the oneness or the unity of everything, to the mystery. You know, there's all different kinds of connections. But to me, spirituality is just about connection.
Yeah, I love that definition. I'm going to definitely be using that because that works really well for me. Because I have a hard time with the word itself. I just have a prejudice against it from a long time ago. And, you know, from having hippie parents where spirituality was like, you know, and that was different than religion. And then there's like that. So all the woo-woo aspect of it, but also all of the organized aspects of it. I resisted as well. So I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's an interesting word because it tends to either be people hear it and they think it's religious, or it's, like you said, it's this very woo-woo, you know, very new age, way out there idea, you know. And to me, it's not, it's just, that's not the meaning that it has to me, but it is a pretty laden word.
Yeah, but if with the meaning that you ascribe to it, the connection, then the action you take can really be purposeful.
Yes.
You know, is this action helping me to connect? Because when I am connected, I'm fulfilled on a level that's not, you know, of the physical world. It's different. It's it's spiritual, I guess. It's difficult for me to define, but it's when I am materially successful, that doesn't satisfy that alone. I need that connection, even if it's just to call somebody that I love to tell them how successful I am. I still need that connection.
Yeah.
So
there's that interesting old story in the founding of AA where, I don't know if you've heard this one, where Bill Wilson was talking with Carl Jung, and Carl Jung was an early, understood what AA was, and he said to Bill Wilson that the word spirits for alcohol was, he tied it back to spiritual in that sense. And I've just always liked that idea, because that's what I feel like in my best moments with my drinking and use, is what I was reaching for was connection.
Yeah. And Bill Wilson was like really into seances. He was Yeah, super
He's a wild
into
guy.
that. Yes, he was a wild guy. Oh boy. I want to talk about the one you feed.
Yeah.
You interview so many incredible people on your podcast. It's really a pleasure to scroll through. I kind of like played roulette with it, where I scrolled and my finger landed somewhere, and I heard an amazing interview. Then I did the same thing. Who are you most? Okay, so let me just say that you have nearly 500 episodes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or yeah, and over 25 million downloads. That's just nuts. It's so good. How long have you had the podcast?
I think we just celebrated our 9-year anniversary, so a long time.
A long time. Oh, so you started the podcast and then you were coaching from the feedback you got from the podcast, so now you're doing both. You're the podcast host and a coach. Who were you most excited to interview? That's hard to say, I know, because you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but
Yeah.
give me a couple names.
Sure. I mean, early on, I interviewed a guy. His name is Mike Scott, and he was in a band. It was a band that was around in the 80s called the Waterboys. They're an Irish band, they opened for U2 a number of times, but they just never got that successful. But they were my favorite band when I started the podcast, I don't know how old I was. What was 9 years ago? I was in my 40s, right? So, this guy had been a hero of mine for coming up on 30 years.
Right.
And so he was probably in our first 20 guests. I couldn't believe he said yes. So that was a really particularly special moment. I've had the chance to interview a number of other musicians who have meant a lot to me. So those are always special because musicians are just something different about it to me.
Yeah.
But having Jack Kornfield on, who's a Buddhist teacher who from when I first got sober back in 1994, I started reading his stuff. And so he's been like a constant companion to me. And I think one of the wisest people around. So that's another one that has felt really special. And then we've done a couple. They weren't exactly me. I guess they weren't me being interviewed, but there's been a couple times that somebody came on and interviewed me and Chris, who is my, I started the podcast with. He does the sound. But he's just been with the thing for so long, and we've been interviewed about like what our friendship has meant, and we've been friends for a long, long time. So that was a special episode. And most recently was another musician, Frank Turner, and a British musician who's the new season of Ted Lasso will come out, and one of his songs is the theme songs, I think, this year.
Really?
Anyway,
I love Ted Lasso.
Yeah. This guy's perfect for Ted Lasso. And but what we did with this last episode was I also then interviewed my partner Ginny and several of my best friends and my son, who all love Frank Turner, asked them to pick a song that they loved by him. And so for me, it's this really special sort of little episode that brings all those things together. But like you said, the list is so long. I feel like I am nearly always really excited because there's so many great people that we've been able to talk to.
Yeah, you have some really good ones, and I'm excited that I'm going to be on your show as well and be amongst those names. Who was the most surprising?
I'll be honest in saying that I don't know that I have a good answer to that, because my way of interviewing people is I'm tending to focus on their work, meaning they've got a book or they've got a series of books, and I've read them. I read almost every book for every guest who comes on. I'll be reading yours here in the near future. And so I'm not that surprised when we get there. And none of it is intended to be like, let me get you saying something you've never said before.
Right. Yeah, right.
I've had some unpleasant surprises, and I will not name who they were, but there have been a couple people, and very, very, very rare. This is the exception to so many amazing people. I've had a couple people whose work I liked, And, I really liked their book, and I got them on the show, and I was like, this was a decidedly unpleasant experience.
Yeah.
Like, they just, and so, but there's only been a couple of those in all these episodes. So I was surprised in that case.
Yeah. We've had a few of those.
Yeah. I think you eventually hit them. So yeah, that's not a great answer, but I don't have a better one.
No, that was really good. And it's actually like that kind of question is something that people want sent ahead of time so that they can start thinking about it. That was just kind of an off the cuff one. I didn't listen to your one with Deepak, but I was thinking, because I use his meditation app every day.
Okay.
And how crazy or strange it would be to hear his voice in real life, like talking to you.
Well, what's interesting is I was a little bit surprised by Deepak.
Okay.
Actually, now that you mention it, and in a good way. I actually don't. I mean, I know who he is, obviously. He's been a giant in the spiritual space for as long as I have been around. And when they came to us and asked to have him on, I was like, well, I don't know his work incredibly well, but he is Deepak Chopra. I probably should say yes to this, right?
Yes.
But I expected that he was going to be like some of the more famous people I've interviewed who weren't really present to me.
Mm.
And he actually really was. He was a very genuine, kind, present. I was pleasantly surprised.
Oh, I'm so
it's
glad
not like
to
I
hear
expected a jerk,
Right,
but I
right.
didn't expect. Yeah, I've just had some experiences with people who have been, at that level where they are sort of just going through the motions. And I did not feel for a minute like he was.
No, I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes, and it's maybe not even the person, but just where they are at that point in their life.
Yeah.
They're going from interview to interview to interview.
Yes.
They've been briefed briefly about what to expect on your show, and so they kind of go through the motions. We used to say that, call it phoning it in. I don't know if people still say that.
They do.
And it is really nice when you're prepared to, kind of, do that. Like, okay, let me get you here because I want to talk about something, that's meaningful for a little bit. And then there's just a flow where they're kind and they're genuine and they're not hurried.
Yes.
Yeah, Scotty and I actually had that experience the other day with Saket Soni. Do you know him?
Not really.
He is he's an Indian man who led what's called the Great Escape. He led 500 Indian men, mainly welders, who have been brought here to this country. And they were kept in a forced labor camp in 2006, 2007, post-Katrina, New Orleans and Texas. And he leads them to freedom.
Wow.
It's an extraordinary story. And so we interviewed him, and I know that he's on a tour. Yeah. And it's such a big subject, and he was just reviewed in the Times. And so I was like, okay, this is going to be like, let's get through it. Yeah. And we had the opposite experience with him. So I absolutely know what you're talking about. And that's nice to hear because I really like Deepak too. And I'm glad to hear that he is, as he sounds on his app in person.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to talk about before we close?
I mean, the only thing that I sort of talk about is kind of like where my work is oriented now, which is, I mean, I still do some one-on-one coaching, but primarily I have something called the Spiritual Habits Program that I do, and it's a program that takes sort of common, I'm going to use the word spiritual principles again, but they're these sort of things that show up through all these different wisdom traditions that are out there. They're the sort of things that almost everybody would agree with, but I then also looked at the science of behavior change. How do we create habits? And I sort of put those two things together to sort of say, like, how do we go from reading and hearing about good ideas to actually living them? And so it's part of my work that I do that I'm really enthusiastic about these days because I love that idea. And I think that those of us who got to be in 12-step programs, there was a real framework for change there that doesn't exist for most people. And I think there are ways of taking that and some other things that we know about how and why people change and trying to offer it more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's really useful, to have, especially because that's one of the things I like about 12-step recovery is I do like the structure and the framework.
Yes.
For me, I don't know that it was necessary, but it was really helpful when I was getting sober.
Yep.
Like you had said earlier, if there were something else available, then, I probably would have tried that and maybe that would have worked. But this is what worked for me.
Yep.
But I love that you're expanding this for people, like this type of work for anyone that needs it or wants it, rather.
Yes.
Probably
Yep.
not
Yep.
for anyone who needs it, because a lot of people might need it and they're not
Yeah.
ready to
Yeah.
do it yet. So that's wonderful. And tell me where people can find you.
Yeah, you can find everything out about us at oneyoufeed.net. That's ONEYOUFEED.net.
Yes, wonderful. Gosh, Eric, this kind of flew by. Thank you so much for just your candor and your honesty and the ease with which you speak. You're very calming. Not that you're I guess you're probably calm too, but you're calming. Your presence is calming. I kind of had my shoulders up because I have a lot on my plate right now when we started the interview. And as we talked, I forgot about everything and I was just into our conversation. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you, Scott. I'm really honored to be on your show. It's such a great show, and I'm excited that you and I will get to talk again soon.
Yes, we will.
Right on.
Hi, I'm Eric Zimmer, and I'm the only one intentionally feeding the good wolf.